The killer who was more feared than Al Capone? Let's talk about that. Greetings, everybody. It's me. Number 10, the director. This week, we are going to be exploring the true story of Carl Panzram, America's most feared killer during the 1920s. Now, if you guys have seen my video on the Hillside Stranglers, then you'll know who our killer is already. But for those of you who haven't, let me catch you up. Carl Panzram was an American serial killer and sex offender who terrorized the United States in the 1920s. He was known for his extreme sadism, being one of the first serial killers in history to torture their victims before killing them, and he also showed a preference for killing young women with red hair, which earned him the moniker, the Redhead Killer. There were two other nicknames that stuck to Panzram during his spree: Bloody Beast and the Monster of the Great Lakes. Now, these came from the media, and they were given to him after he would send taunting letters to the police force after his crimes. One such letter was sent after the slaying of Lillian Kriegmail. In this letter, Panzram wrote, "I want to tell you that I am the monster that has been taking the lives of so many girls around Chicago. You can never catch me. I'm too cute for you." How gross is that? One's reign of terror began in September of 1920 when he killed his first victim, known as Speedy. She was found dead near Chicago with her skull smashed open with a large rock. Panzram would continue to take young women's lives over the next 3 years, the majority of his murders happening between 1921 and 1922. His preferred method of murder was strangulation, though he did beat several of his victims to death as well. At least 13 murders could be linked back to Panzram, but it is suspected that he had actually killed closer to 21 people. The majority of his victims were discovered along the northwestern coast of the United States, particularly in Washington State and Chicago. But he did kill as far south as Texas and as far east as Pennsylvania. On December 8, 1921, Panzram was finally arrested after a manhunt that had been ongoing for months. He was charged with the murder of 16-year-old Lillian Kriegmail. He was arrested at a boarding house where he had been living under the alias Charlie Bigelow. When the police searched his room, they found several items that linked him to the crime scene, including a pair of shoes that matched the footprints left behind by the killer. They also found a rope similar to the one used to strangle Mrs. Kriegmail. Lastly, they found a bloody meat cleaver in his suitcase, which also matched the weapon left behind at the scene. When they brought Panzram into the station house for questioning, they thought that they had a pretty solid case against him. After all, they had plenty of evidence linking him to the crime scenes. Plus, in a previous case, a witness had come forward and said that they had seen Panzram with Kriegmail right before she went missing. But the detectives soon realized that Panzram was a lot smarter than your average killer. He had carefully crafted alibis for every crime he committed, alibis that even a moron like me could understand. For example, when he was questioned about the footprints at the crime scene, Panzram explained that he had walked barefoot for weeks, and that this would explain why the prints matched. He said that he had injured his feet while working in a lead mine, which caused the skin to fall off his toes and eventually led to his entire soles becoming calloused.
Ow!
How stupid do you think that is? Like, really? I mean, just think about it. People don't typically go barefoot for weeks on end, especially not in the early 1920s. That's just crazy. But unfortunately for the detectives, a lot of people believed his story. Even the police chief himself was convinced that he wasn't guilty. And as time passed, the public began to doubt whether or not he was truly the killer. On top of that, his alibi for the murder of Mrs. Kriegmail was airtight. According to Panzram, he had been in Tacoma, Washington at the time of the murder, having just arrived there on a boat. He explained that he had sailed from San Francisco to Portland, Oregon, and then boarded another boat bound for Victoria, Canada. What happens to be that the ship that supposedly took him to Victoria, Canada, happened to be carrying a witness who corroborated his story. So after putting a dent in the case, Panzram figured that he had gotten away with it again. He continued his murderous ways after being let go by the cops. He would kill at least 4 more times before he was caught. In February of 1922, Panzram killed Ruth Reynolds, a 22-year-old prostitute. Her body was found in an advanced stage of decomposition, leading the authorities to believe that she had been dead for some time. This meant that the full force of the media hit Panzram, and there was a heavy demand for justice. People across the country wanted the killer brought to justice, especially because he had become such a problem. In fact, he was so much of a problem that J. Edgar Hoover offered a reward of $10,000 for information leading to his arrest. At the time, this was an enormous sum of money, and it demonstrated just how much the government wanted Panzram locked up. As the pressure mounted, the police focused on building a new case against him. They pulled up the carpet in his former apartment and sent it to the lab, where traces of blood were found, meaning that Panzram had probably slaughtered someone inside the apartment. Unfortunately for the detectives, they still didn't have enough to charge him, and he would remain free until June. At the end of the month, Panzram was once again arrested for suspicion of vagrancy. He was picked up by the police after officers saw him sleeping in an alleyway. While he was sitting in jail waiting for his trial, word got out that Panzram was the prime suspect in the recent killings. Because of this, a detective paid him a visit to see if anything new had come to light. During the course of the interrogation, the detective suggested that Panzram had killed a certain woman and asked him to respond with either a yes or a no. Now, instead of keeping his mouth shut, which would have been the smart move, Panzram opened his mouth and talked. He denied that he had killed the woman. Once the detective left, Panzram knew that he had made a mistake. He had grown accustomed to lying to the police at this point, and he had become somewhat lazy with it. He hadn't thought about how his answer could affect the rest of the questioning. Unfortunately for him, the detective had been smart enough to record his statement. He had used a hidden microphone in his briefcase to record Panzram's response. This was extremely illegal at the time, but luckily for the police, Panzram wasn't thinking clearly, and he didn't notice the device in the briefcase. Once the recording was played for the judge, Panzram's fate was sealed. The police now had a reason to keep him incarcerated. He was convicted of vagrancy and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Luckily for the detectives, this gave them plenty of time to build a case against him for the murders. After his release from prison, Panzram moved to New York City, where he lived on the streets and begged for money. But he was always spotted by the police, and they would chase him away. Everywhere he went, the law was hot on his trail. They had put a massive amount of pressure on the police forces around the country to capture Panzram. So it was almost impossible for him to hide. Eventually, he was picked up for suspicion of burglary and sent to the infamous Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Here, the authorities hoped that Panzram would stay off the streets and away from innocent people. But the cunning killer managed to escape. He broke out by hiding in the back of a truck that was delivering coal to the prison. From there, he hitchhiked to New Jersey, where he boarded a train that would take him to Manhattan. Once in New York City, he continued to live on the streets and beg for money. But the cops were still after him, and it was only a matter of time before he was caught. He was arrested for breaking into cars and then imprisoned at the Manhattan House of Corrections. But Panzram escaped here too. He waited until one night when the guards were asleep and then used a metal rod to pry open a window. Once outside, he jumped onto the fire escape and climbed down several stories. Then he ran away into the city. After this, Panzram continued to evade the police for a couple more months. He was able to stay off the grid due to his small stature and the fact that he was balding, which helped him to avoid recognition. But inevitably, he was picked up for breaking into another car and sentenced to prison. This time, he was sent to the infamous Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, where he would be held for the rest of his life. While on Alcatraz, Panzram tried to convince the guards that he was harmless, but they didn't buy it. They kept him locked up tight and isolated from the other inmates. But this didn't stop Panzram from planning his next move. Just 3 years into his sentence, he befriended another inmate named Joe Johnson and tricked him into helping him escape. It was the middle of the night, and the pair snuck into the prison library. They stole some tools and used them to cut through the bars of a window. Once outside, they hid in the laundry room until morning. Then they slipped past the guards and escaped onto the island. They stole a boat and set sail for freedom. But it wasn't long before the Coast Guard caught up with them. Panzram and Johnson were taken back to Alcatraz, where they were both given life sentences without the possibility of parole. Panzram died in 1949 of a heart attack. He had spent 27 years in prison by that point, and the end was probably a relief for him. But what do you think? Leave it in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.